Thank you. And it's no longer good morning, but good morning. It's a pleasure to be in Santiago. This is my second visit to this great city and this great country, and so I'm very pleased that I was asked to come and talk about social vulnerability and community resilience and how we go about measuring these. One of the things that I will emphasize throughout this talk is how do you translate science into practice and policy. The notion of vulnerability and resilience science is really looking at those circumstances that, on the one hand, place people and localities at risk, and on the other hand, what can be done to mitigate or reduce those risks by increasing or enhancing resilience. The goal, from my perspective, is in essence to provide the scientific basis for disaster and hazard reduction policies. And again, the evidentiary basis for that, rather than just saying, yes, you're vulnerable, but provide an opportunity to look at what is vulnerability, how is it measured, and how can those tools be translated. There are very broad social processes at work, and what you see in vulnerability science and resilience science is really the intersection of three different domains of knowledge. We heard earlier today about engineering and the built environment. We will hear a little bit in this session about the natural processes and human interactions. And because I'm a geographer, I'm interested in how we understand the intersections of all of these as it affects individual places. And so that's the framework that I begin with. Social vulnerability is a concept that has been around for a couple of decades, and it really is the approach to identify those population characteristics that influence the social burdens or the social distribution of risk. And it also allows us to understand how these factors influence the loss that these individuals, communities bear. We know from about 60 years of social science research in areas that have experienced disasters that special needs populations are one of the most vulnerable subgroups in our communities, in our cities. We know that age makes a difference in terms of the ability to prepare for and respond to disasters. And it's the extremes of the age category. That is, it's the very, very young children and the very, very old. We know that socioeconomic status influences capacities to prepare, respond, and recover from disasters. For the wealthy, they have the ability to absorb losses, but they actually have more to lose. And at the same time, we see that the lower income poverty populations also are extremely vulnerable. Race and ethnicity, gender is a particular concern that has come out over and over again in the literature and in practice. This is related to the caregiving role that women provide in many societies, the specific gender-specific employment that many women are engaged in, and the fact that they earn less money than their male counterparts, and then also family structure. So individually, collectively, whether or not it's a developing country or a developed nation, these broad concepts come out over and over again in terms of these are the factors that we know influence social vulnerability. In 2003, we developed an empirically based measure of vulnerability called the Social Vulnerability Index, or SOVI. And what this does is it takes those broad concepts in the previous slide and puts specific variables attached to them. We used a particular administrative unit in our looking at the United States. For Chile, it would be the second administrative unit. You could use your regions or your the third one, which is the comunas. And what we did is we assumed that vulnerability is not a unidimensional construct. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you're vulnerable. It's the combination of being poor, being uneducated, being elderly, that combine to create the vulnerability. And we were able, through statistical analyses, to generate 7 factors that explain 2/3, 3/4 of the variability in the input data. And the map that you see is the output from that. And the map allows you to geographically look at the vulnerability, where it is highest and where it is lowest. And because we are interested in communicating this to policymakers and to the public, we use red and blue as colors because our political parties are identified as red states and blue states. The red states are muy mal, and the blue states are very good. But I have no, you can see where I am in the political spectrum. And instead of developing the categories like good geographers and cartographers based on standard deviations, which we did, we simply colored them as high, medium, and low, representing the top 20%, which is basically one standard deviation from the mean. And what you can see here is the distribution across the United States in terms of, in terms of the vulnerability. And this particular index allows you to look actually at the output data to see what's explaining the vulnerability. And what you see along the Texas-Mexican border are populations that are Hispanic, where English is not their first language. Their educational levels are low. They have lots of small children in the household and are primarily involved in agricultural and service sector economy, and that explains their vulnerability. We have attempted over the years to take this algorithm, this particular methodological approach, and apply it to different cultures and different areas. And this is one of our most recent efforts looking at Brazil. And what you can see here, the factors that have been identified, again, they are customized. Poverty in Brazil is defined by a variable that's very different than poverty in the United States, as would poverty in Chile. But when you put it into this factor analytic solution, poverty comes out. Urban-rural development comes out as a main factor in Brazil, along with migration and all the way down to extractive industries. This followed the methodology very, very carefully, and we get, again, 2/3 of the explanation in the variability. And to highlight differences, they used a 5-category mapping scheme rather than a 3-category mapping scheme. We have done SOVI types of analyses in Brazil, in China, in Portugal, and believe it or not, in Norway, which I used to think of as being a fairly uniform society, but there is quite a bit of social differentiation within that country as well. Perhaps the most exciting thing is what has been done recently, which is to move SOVI from just an academic exercise into an operational tool. We had a major flood in the state of South Carolina, located here, in 2005. And the governor of the state and the Disaster Recovery Office were interested in finding an apolitical way of differentially allocating recovery resources. And they asked us to come over and talk with them as part of the recovery. We explained the SOVI tool and how it was an apolitical way of showing where you had your most socially vulnerable populations. And when you take that and you overlay damage, and in this case, this was the number of housing units that FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Agency, said had damage, and you put those two together in a bivariate map, you can identify those areas in purple that have the highest amount of social vulnerability and the greatest amount of damage. And this is, in fact, the place where they are putting the majority of the recovery resources, in places like Georgetown and Williamsburg, which you can see in the pie chart, which looks at the distribution of the funds. And so this is the first time that this tool, which was an academic piece of science that has been translated into practice. And earlier, or late last week, we've done a run for the state of Louisiana with the flooding in the Baton Rouge area, who also want to use this tool as a way of differentially allocating resources. And you can do it because it's an apolitical way of identifying that subpopulation. Social vulnerability has been around for quite a while, but over time there's been an increasing interest in resilience and how you move from the concepts of disaster risk reduction into a more sustainable future. We've gotten lots of kudos here about the Disaster Resilience Report, which I was part of, but UK Science has also done a major study on resilience, as has UNISDR, and of course, we're all familiar with the Rockefeller effort. Many definitions of resilience, we've heard them today. Resilience, in the language of today, this morning anyway, has been more about being a process with some outcomes. And when you look over the literature, you can see that it's both a process and an outcome. You also see that some of the properties of resilience are inherent within systems, but you also can have resilience that's adaptive, that is, resilience occurring on the fly as a situation occurs. And you can apply resilience to multiple scales and units of analyses. This morning's session primarily looked at buildings and infrastructure systems, but you can equally apply it to a host of other things. The measurement of resilience is a very messy landscape, and it includes lots of different indices and tools and scorecards. And depending on which resilience measure you look at, you're going to get a very different story. Some are top-down approaches. What we heard mostly today were bottom-up type approaches. Some are qualitative, some are quantitative. Spatial scales run from everything from a local neighborhood to a whole community, to a whole nation, to a whole continent. Some have a particular focus on assets, things. Others look more broadly at developing baselines, which look at capacities or the evaluation of performance. And so what we have then is a real mix of different kinds of indices, tools, and scorecards. I lump them all together, and they all have a different purpose. They've all been developed for individual applications across the world, actually. One of my particular pet peeves has been the development of efforts to enhance resilience without knowing where you are to begin with. So, how can you measure progress towards achieving resilience if you don't know where you started? We have no baseline for resilience, for measuring resilience. So if you had to demonstrate the cost-benefit of your resilience intervention, how are you going to do that when you don't know where you started, when you don't have the baseline? The challenges of doing this, I think we've heard already. There are so many different approaches. There are different definitions of resilience. You need to make it simple so it can be replicated over time. You need to make it evidentiary because the policymaker is not going to pay that much attention to you unless you can demonstrate it empirically, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, I just think it's this, as opposed to, well, here's the evidence that suggests this. And it has to be meaningful from a variety of different scales. So there's an enormous amount of challenge in just developing a baseline, let alone looking at resilience of certain systems. If you look at primarily the social science literature, but not exclusively so, what you see is different kinds of resilience that play out in the literature very, very large. A few years ago when we started the NRC report, it was pretty easy to get a handle on the research literature. In the last 3 years, it has just exploded, and it's very hard to keep up on what that resilience literature is. But by and large, there are 6 different components that you can find in the literature that come out over and over again. Social resilience, economic resilience, infrastructure resilience, which is largely in the domain of the engineering sciences, institutional capacity or institutional resilience, which is what you see a lot in the governance literature, community capacity, and then environmental resilience. And this is actually where the concept got started initially in the 70s. Within each one of these, there are obviously interactions, and there are differences between inherent vulnerabilities in these systems and inherent resilience. But when you look at it, resilience and vulnerability are not the same. They're not the flip side of one another. The science of resilience is trying to figure out what data you use, what government agency has that data, the periodic updates of the information, and the enumeration unit that you're going to look at. And so what we've developed is one approach to this. It's not perfect, but we have to start somewhere. And what we did was develop what we call the Baseline Resilience Indicators for Community, or BRIC. And here we wanted to make it much simpler than the Social Vulnerability Index, where you didn't need a sophisticated statistical package to do it. You could do it on a spreadsheet, and you simply scale your values from 0 to 1, where 0 means it reduces resilience and 1 increases resilience, and then you can develop your theoretical scores from that. The idea is we want to get to the orange juice, but we have a mix of different kinds of input variables that we need to scale appropriately so that we can, in the end, combine them. And we need to make some assessments in terms of the category weighting scheme. And because we cannot make the assessment that social resilience is more important than economic resilience, or that infrastructure resilience is more important than social resilience, we simply assume that all of these sub-indices are weighted the same, even though the input variables may be differentially weighted. Again, you can add these scores. It's a very simple additive model, and you can come up again with a mapping scheme. I'm a geographer, and I think the easiest way to communicate complex information is not through an equation, but through a map, because people get a map. And the areas in purple are those areas in the United States where we have relatively low levels of resilience, and the areas in green are where we see actually higher levels of resilience. And you can deconstruct this resilience as well by looking at each one of its component parts. So figure A is the social resilience, and you can see the social resilience is actually quite high in the northern tier of states in the United States, whereas in figure F, the environmental resilience is actually much greater along the coastal areas. When we're talking about community resilience, we're actually speaking about the system of systems. And this is really the approach that we've taken. And a community is a system of systems. And in order to look at the resilience, you need to examine the infrastructure system within the community and how that infrastructure system interrelates with the economic system. And they have to all come together to create this system of systems, which is what community resilience is all about. So, concluding about why we need resilience measurement, it's a tool and approach that can help prioritize needs and prioritize goals. It certainly is useful and critical for monitoring progress and recognizing success, and also recognizing failure and where you need to put more effort, more resources. It certainly allows you to understand the costs and benefits of your financial investments and your human capital investments in resilience, and certainly allows you to look at the effectiveness of different policies and approaches. And this last one is really important because all too often in most countries, we never do a post-evaluation of policy and programs. We simply assume that they work, and then we move on to the next one. And the case in point is in the United States with its flood insurance program. There has never been a systematic assessment of the effectiveness of the U.S. flood insurance program and whether or not it actually reduces flood loss or acts as a stimulant for increasing flood losses because it provides a safety net for people to build in stupid places where they shouldn't build in the first place. But if we're thinking about resilience measurement, we have to recognize that a one-size metric is not going to fit all. It may not work at a bottom-up community scale for all the reasons that the previous panel talked about, but at a meso scale, if you are a government and you want to look at where you want to make investments at a community level or at a regional level, I think it's very, very useful. There are lots of tools out there, but very few of them are used. Some of them are too complex, some of them are too simple. Communities certainly have the potential to develop their own index, their own baselines, but how do you compare one community to another, particularly if you're trying to allocate resources as equally as possible? And the tools, I think, the measurement tools are helpful, in particular in identifying risks and taking steps to do it. They're also useful, as we heard earlier, about getting stakeholders to work together. The caution that I leave is that measurement tools don't create the resilient community, but they certainly can help you along the path of becoming safer, stronger, and more vibrant in the face of unanticipated events. Thank you.